And it is now time to move on to our last panel of the day, as incredible as it sounds. The title is Communicating COVID-19, and the chair is David Smith from the University of Leicester. David is also the managing editor of our journal, and I am really glad I have the opportunity to thank him publicly for the great work that he does every day to make sure our journal works as smoothly as this conference is working. So over to you, David, and thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Christian, and thanks for the very generous introduction and for organising the conference so well. So I'm very excited to chair this particular panel. Very timely topic, as anyone who's seen the programme will be able to tell. It's communicating COVID-19, and we have a very international array of authors and presenters, and also in terms of the topics as well. So it should be a very lively and interesting panel. I've seen that we already have all of our speakers. I believe Anfan Chen will be speaking first, followed by Declan, McDowell-Naylor, and then I think I saw Anne Schultz as well. So presumably those will be the speakers. And we'll start off with Anfan with a paper titled Pandemic Nationalism, How Exposure to Government Social Media Affects People's Beliefs in COVID-19 Conspiracy Theories in China. Just before we start, obviously the normal rules that everyone is now very familiar with apply. So I'll have a stopwatch on, and I'll try and take an opportune moment at 12 and 15 minutes just to let you know where you are in terms of your timing. And please keep the questions coming in the chat. So anyway, over to you, Anfan.
Okay, thank you, Loud. Okay, let me share the screen. Okay, yeah, hi everyone. I'm Anfan Chen. Now I'm a postdoc research from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. I'm happy to have the opportunity to participate in the seminar hosted by IJPP today and share our latest research on behalf of our research group, including the Yingdan from Stanford University, and Kaiping Chen from University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Aaron from National University of Singapore. Then today, I want to present, is how citizens' exposure to government social media information and the nationalism during the COVID-19 epidemic, and how that affect people's understanding and belief of the COVID-19 related conspiracy narrative. And then, well, the COVID-19 spread aggressively and rapidly across the world. Many societies have also witnessed the spread of other viral phenomena like misinformation, conspiracy theories, and some mass suspicions about what is really going on and what is considered as a major challenge for the modern democracies. For instance, there are lots of prevalent conspiracy narratives like the 5G spreading coronavirus, and Bill Gates is the creator of the virus. That's ridiculous. Also, some misinformation or conspiracy may say that China utilized the COVID-19 to paralyze the Western economy, and COVID-19 is the genie weapon from US, or something like that. Those conspiracy theories have extremely negative impact on the prevention and control of the pandemic and coping strategy of the individuals. Okay. Also, under this background, if we take a look at the Chinese context, the Chinese public relies greatly on social media to cope with the epidemic situation. And information exposure on social media is associated with greater conspiracy belief towards the COVID-19 pandemic. Then the Chinese, but at the same time, the Chinese government actively disseminates epidemic statistic control measures and response to public concerns through social media challenge during that time. Then, how does exposing to governmental social media content associated with belief in conspiracy targeting China and the US among the Chinese social media users. Then we would like to propose a concept. The pandemic nationalism is in the play with the pandemic nationalism is unfolded with the COVID-19 outbreak and is in the play with the complicated geopolitics factors such as the Sino-US tension. So making nationalism uprising, making the nationalism uprising around the world. And we would like to call that pandemic nationalism in this study. Then from the social psychology perspective, we would like to divide the pandemic nationalism into two dimensions, the in-group solidarity and the out-group and perceived out-group threat. Based on this background, and we propose a question: what's the association among governmental social media exposure, in-group solidarity, out-group threat, and the conspiracy belief towards the China and the US, as well as we proposed a series of hypotheses like the exposure to information from government social media accounts will be negatively associated with in-group solidarity, and positively associated with perceived out-group threat. And then we propose another two hypotheses. The in-group solidarity is negatively associated with belief in conspiracy theory towards China. However, it is positively associated with that toward the US. And we also proposed a hypothesis from the exposure to information from government social media and belief in COVID-19 related conspiracy theories toward China and the US, positively and negatively separated. To answer this question and examine the hypothesis, we conducted a survey in the mainland China during the February to March 2021, with quota sampling according to a population proportion of the Chinese General Social Survey, which resulting in 714 valid participants. We measured conspiracy theories. We measured conspiracy theories with eight prevalent conspiracy narrative on the Chinese social media, and exposure to information from government social media content with the frequency of social media consumption, content consumption from the government social media accounts. Then in-group solidarity with 4 items from established survey questions, and out-group threat with 8 items from on symbolic and realistic threat. Then our results show that our result in these slides. We find that exposure to information from governmental social media has a positive association with in-group solidarity. However, and in-group solidarity have a negative association with belief in COVID-19 related conspiracy toward China. However, positive association with that toward the US. For perceived out-group threat is association with exposure to information from governmental social media is significantly positive. And the perceived out-group threat have a positive association with the belief in COVID-19 related conspiracy theory toward US. However, have a negative but not significant association with belief in COVID-19 related conspiracy theories toward China. And we also examine the direct association from the IV's exposure to information from government social media two DVs, including beliefs in COVID-19 related conspiracy theory toward China, as well as the US, but only the association from exposure to misinformation from government social media and the belief in COVID-19 related conspiracy theories toward the US is significantly positive. In order to further verify our conclusion, we tested whether the two indirect effects are valid through the past analysis. In the result, we found that exposure to information from government social media impact on their belief in COVID-19 related conspiracy theory toward the US through the mediation of in-group solidarity and perceived out-group threat. However, for the degree of belief in the COVID-19 related conspiracy theories toward China, it is only mediated by their in-group solidarity, but it's negative. Okay, based on the analysis we reported above, we have chosen conclusions such as exposure to information, social media information, increased belief in COVID-19 conspiracy toward the US, both directly and through triggering nationalism, that is mediated by the nationalism. And greater exposure to government content on social media decreased the belief in China-related conspiracy through triggering a stronger sense of in-group solidarity. And the results are robust even after controlling for the individual level psychological and contextual that can predict conspiracy belief. Also, we provided some discussions about our study. The nationalism in misinformation processing during crises have some implication for the individual level factor associated with macro forces such as the global uprising of nationalism and influence of government social media accounts on conspiracy perception have some political implications, such as political and contextual meanings for the influence of government social media. And the practical implications and the conspiracy mitigation and misinformation correction are addressed in our study. Then thank you for all your listening, and we hope any comments and suggestions. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you, Anfan. You were actually just under, slightly under 12 minutes, so fantastic on the timing as well. So that gives us a lot of time now for some discussion. So please keep your questions coming in on the chat. But for now, maybe I'll start us off with something maybe that's you don't necessarily show here, or maybe you don't necessarily have it kind of in the data, but I just wonder if you could comment or characterize the kind of communication that you're talking about on the government social media. So one kind of question that came to mind as you were speaking was, why would you expect such an effect on the outgroup of the US based on the kind of content that one might see on the government social media account? So could you characterize the kind of content that you would see that would relate to your findings?
Okay. Yeah, that is unusual, maybe in some other context, but in some authoritarian society, the government will utilize social media to do some such as propaganda and the crisis communication through social media account. But when they deliver nationalism or their patriotism, they may mislead the public to understand or out-group threat or in-group pride, and that which in turn triggers misinformation spreading. That what came into my mind. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. And so could you also talk about this issue around the China and the US, because obviously many of us in the West will be familiar with the contemporary kind of diatribes that were aimed at China from the then US president. But I'm personally not as familiar with any kind of outgroup othering or conspiracy belief kind of information that was coming at the US from China. So it's interesting that that you've kind of considered the kind of the reverse directionality there of the kind of China to US angle, whereas many of us are familiar with the 45th president's racist othering of Chinese people when he was talking about the virus. So could you just talk to us about the context there, where you kind of decided that the US would be the most appropriate kind of case in terms of understanding this outgroup perception, and why it might not have been the case that other countries would have come into that consideration?
Okay. Yeah, it is a special case study in the Chinese context, but under Europe or the USA context, we may see some polarization or some polarized group. Under this context, we may see some similar results if we take the partisanship or the partisan, which result in polarized opinion. Yeah, I think they will have similar mechanism. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm waiting to see if anyone has any questions in the chat box. We still have a few minutes. Okay, Ozan has a question. Thank you very much. Ozan says, great presentation, Anfan. Can you give some examples of the 8 conspiracy items used in the survey? Did they include items on lab leak hypothesis, a topic of recent debates between China and the US?
Okay. You mean some examples in my survey about the conspiracy items, right?
Yes, the items used in the survey, yes, on conspiracy.
Yeah, as I proposed in the study, we have four in group. That is the some conspiracy narrative targeting China, and another 4 targeting the US, because US when compared to the China, US is the out group, right? And regarding out group, we may in my personnel, such as Bill Gates. Bill Gates created the coronavirus for profits. That is the outgroup. But for the in-group conspiracy narrative, we have examples such as coronavirus is the bioweapon of the Chinese government for controlling the global economy. That is one of the 4 in-group conspiracy narrative. Yeah, all these conspiracy narratives or examples are validated by their fact checkers. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Are there any other questions that anyone has at this point? If you don't have them ready right now, then you can provide them in the chat box, and Anfan can get to them during the next presentation.
If I may just quickly jump in. Well, first of all, thanks for a very interesting presentation. I think I would just like, I don't have a question about the study, but itself, which was very clearly presented, but more about the implications. So how do we deal with pandemic nationalism when it's a pandemic that involves the whole world and where nobody is safe until everyone is safe? I mean, I understand I'm not asking you a question you have an easy answer for, but I was wondering if you could, perhaps reflect a little bit on the implications of your finding for the fact that, this is not an issue where we can afford to have these kinds of nationalisms.
Yeah. Because the nationalism, is very sensitive in the public, especially under COVID-19 background. So when the government deliver some COVID-19 misinformation, they should be careful they should be careful when doing that kind of thing, especially as the crisis, the COVID-19 crisis is unfolding. We don't know whether we don't know the results if the government just casually delivers some information to the public. Yeah.
And Anfan, is there any kind of cynicism or criticism towards some of this pandemic nationalism within China? Is there any kind of resistance on social media, or is it kind of something that you just that's kind of more widely accepted?
Yeah, just social media.
Okay. Okay. Thanks very much, Anfan. I think we can just about move on. We've made 5 minutes on our time, but please, if you have any questions for Anfan, then we can continue with them in the chat, and maybe we'll develop some further thoughts as the other presentations go on. But thanks very much, Anfan. That was a brilliant presentation. The next presentation we have is going to be presented, I believe, by Declan McDowell-Naylor from Cardiff University, representing Stephen Cushion and Richard Thomas, also from Cardiff and Swansea University. And this is about the alternative media environment in both the post-Corbyn era and through the COVID-19 pandemic. So take it away, Declan.
Thank you very much. So firstly, just wanted to say I'm glad I'm to be here today, and to Christian for putting together such a well-organised and interesting online conference. And so thank you very much for that. And thank you all for being here today to see this presentation. So the talk is, I think, slight outlier in the sense that COVID-19 isn't necessarily the objective analysis here. It's very much more the context for this set of findings, which I'm going to be presenting. The title of this presentation today is Understanding the Agenda of Alternative Online Political Media, Post-Corbyn and Through the Pandemic. And representing today, of course, my colleagues Stephen Cushion and Richard Thomas. But very quick introduction about the project. If you haven't heard about it, it's a 3-year ESRC funded project looking at alternative online political media in the UK, looking at 3 key things: their content that they produce, how they produce that content, the kind of production that goes into that, and the consumption of that material by audiences. So just as a very quick overview of the outlets that we're looking at, I'm aware that not everyone may be familiar with these, but in the interest of time, I can't explain each one. But the impetus for the project really stems from the fact that 2017, there's a kind of huge explosion of alternative media in the UK. And this was kind of the impetus of the project. It's brought a lot of these sites to the fore, produced a lot of commentary and analysis. Since then, a lot of these outlets have continued to exist and have changed in various ways. The sites you see here were the ones that we included in our initial sample. And then, of course, as the project developed, we've looked at a wider range of outlets that have come and gone as well. So while you might not be familiar with all of these outlets, hopefully you'll be able to pick up some of the details as the talk goes on. But as the talk from the team at the University of Gothenburg showed this morning, alternative media and independent media are something that exists in many countries. So hopefully it's something that you can maybe have seen in your own media systems and be able to sort of infer or think about a little bit further through the UK context where we're looking here. Just as a quick outline of the project to contextualise what I'm going to be presenting today. What I'm going to be presenting today is the interview findings that we have, but these interview findings fit within a broader range of findings, which of course welcome questions on. So phase one of our project was a longitudinal content analysis of a wide variety of articles from 9 outlets, as well as tweets, and we also did a content analysis of media critique within those articles within the same time frame. So the idea here was very much exploratory. We're trying to build a picture of what was going on with the content of these outlets earlier on between 2015 and 2018, something we called the RISE phase. Second phase of our project involved a survey of 2,751 respondents about their media consumption, with the aim of, the true aim really of conducting in-depth follow-up surveys with as many alternative media users as we could, and in the end we managed to conduct that survey of 303 alternative media users. It's an audience study. And as I mentioned, the focus of today's panel, today's presentation is the 41 interviews we conducted with editors and contributors to alternative and independent media. And we're now moving into phase 3 of our project, which is a hypothesis-driven content analysis using the earlier findings to conduct some more purposeful content analysis on up-to-date findings from 2020 and 2021. I was hoping to present the content analysis findings, but we only finished them this morning. There was some hold up with our intercoder reliability and logistical things, but basically I'm happy to talk about that from an impressionistic point of view, having not fully looked at those findings yet.
Declan, sorry to interrupt. I just wonder if you might want to switch your screens around because we can see the presenter mode kind of thing.
Okay.
I don't want to interrupt too much disruption. So if it's a quick thing,
no problem.
Otherwise, you can carry on as it is.
Let me just.
I'm not sure how to do it myself, but just if you wanted, I think it might be to do with dual screen sharing. But sorry to interrupt.
Is that better? Does that improve?
Yeah, perfect. Thanks.
Okay, fantastic, cool. Right, so just to quickly contextualize this within the literature, there's a very broad emergent range of academic literature looking at alternative media in the last couple of years. What kind of typifies this literature at the moment is an interest in trying to understand the fundamental nature of alternative and independent media. In different case studies have emerged from different national contexts, which we've kind of we've been looking at, of course. What connects all of them and what connects our paper, because we're also trying to do this, trying to understand the fundamental nature of alternative media as it's newly emerged in the last few years. What the kind of overarching theoretical perspective that cuts across all of our papers and outputs is this kind of relational perspective between alternative and mainstream media, which was put forward in a paper a couple of years ago, which I'll put on the screen for you to have a look at. As well as that, we've kind of, within the broader literature and journalism studies, we're interested in these normative debates in the field about journalism, the very nature and classification of journalism, the disruptions within journalism, which we think alternative media are quite emblematic of. So in some cases, we've applied norms to our findings to kind of take that kind of perspective on, you know, how close are alternative media to traditional norms of journalism, to what extent do they disrupt these norms, to what extent do they engage in the kind of discussion about what is journalism, that classic question that runs through journalism studies. I thought Nick's paper earlier was great, Nick Ansted's paper, because it kind of got at the way we've been thinking about this kind of these different value systems of journalism that are in play when you think about alternative media as maybe like a kind of peripheral range of journalism as against the kind of core, you know, traditional forms of journalism. So that was a really interesting paper for me to listen to earlier as well. So just on to the interviews then, and the findings. And what I've tried to do here is just pull out as many strands as I can to aid discussion and questions, which is hopefully we'll be able to discuss. Just a really quick ask from everyone, if you could not share the quotes on social media. I know this has been recorded and that's fine, but I have some sort of agreements in place with a few of my interviewees when it comes to publishing quotes. Some of them are under anonymity, some of them have asked to be able to have sight of quotes in context. So just this is a kind of a polite request to not share any of the quotes on social media, if you could, please. Okay, just a break of our sample then. So the interviews took place between November 2020 and April 2021, so right in the midst of COVID, really. but after a lot of what's happened in recent years with alternative media. So there's a lot of retrospective kind of perspective going on here, which is quite useful for us. The entire interview process was done online during the pandemic, which posed difficulties when it comes to kind of traditional fieldwork techniques and rapport building. As you can see here quite clearly as well, we had difficulty recruiting right-wing interviewees. Often we didn't get a reply, or sometimes told quite straightforwardly that they didn't want to take part. So there's a very labor-intensive process just getting the few right-wing interviewees that I managed to recruit into the interview sample. Our sample was dominated by individuals from the Bar and the Canary, who were quite willing to take part. Byline Times also very willing to engage with us. Because they're quite a small team, what we have there is pretty much full coverage of Byline Times' team. And then in some example cases like the Squawk Box, you only have one individual to interview, so that's why the number is low there. The sites under other are sites that we didn't include in our content analysis. So Evolve Politics, of course, is a left-wing outlet, but because it's kind of died in a sense, or at least it's not putting out much content, we chose not to include it in our most recent content analysis. Similarly with Westminster. But any questions about the interview sample, I'm very happy to talk about. So I've got 5-6 minutes here, which is perfect. So I'm just going to kind of run through some strands and some quotes, basically, that are kind of, I think, are quite indicative, and then round up at the end of this a couple of points which hopefully should aid discussion around this issue. So one of the key themes that cuts across a lot of the interviews is this emphasis on the inherently political nature of all journalism, effectively. So if you see some of these quotes here, we got this one here about journalism being politically committed, but there's also this adherence to this idea of objective journalism. So trying to hold together in tension a lot of these traditional ideas about journalism, it's being an objective, detached kind of view from nowhere, alongside having a kind of political commitment. And the justification for that often is that mainstream media journalists are politically committed. That's what a lot of the alternative media editors and contributors say. They're more open about it. They're more honest about it in that sense, what they say. From a right-wing perspective, to balance that out, we've again here you can see clear engagement with kind of cultural wars topics. Again, attaching that to the idea that the mainstream media is just as political as they are in their agenda. So some interesting findings here about what journalism is and the models of journalism that are applied and how that's contextualized by alternative media practitioners in relation to the mainstream media. Interestingly as well, of course, if you're thinking back to that sliding relational graph I showed you at the start, there's a tendency towards professionalization among a lot of the outlets and the people that we spoke to. So you can see I often ask people in interviews about their practices, their journalistic process, how they go about creating stories. So we see here from an editor from a left-wing outlet talking about maintaining mainstream standards, fact-checking, all of these things. Talking very clearly about how can they professionalize, how can they make their outlets, do more of that kind of thing. And as well as that, we also have, the kind of quest for legitimacy, the idea that they want to be seen as regulated, trained, serious journalism. And a lot of this, again, it kind of relates to mainstream media in the sense that a lot of the commentary and write-ups in the mainstream media have been very critical of alternative media, and they're very aware of that. So there is this kind of consistent attempt to use professionalization as a kind of way to get and gain legitimacy in the wider media system with their mainstream peers. Building on that, when we talk about practices that happen within the organizations, if you want to think about the hybrid media perspective, you can have a look here at some of these quotes which talk about new practices and old practices. So being able to do a remote newsroom. I think there was a paper a couple of years ago by Mark Durst talking about this media and this idea that the newsroom centric view is kind of dispersing, is breaking down, because you can do journalism from lots of different locations. But alongside that, there's this incorporation of very traditional practices like stand-ups, having editorial meetings, and thinking very clearly about how your content fits in with the rest of the media environment. Okay, just going to wrap this up. So again, thinking about Corbyn, we have this high political coverage, lots of reflections on how they kind of covered Corbyn from left-wing outlets, and it's now this kind of reconciliation with what happened there and trying to reshape their agenda. Similarly, on the right, we have Brexit coverage, some retrospective looks, and even some ambivalence about the way that they put across that content as well. So there is this introspection that goes on among alternative media. And then finally, criticism of the BBC. The thing to really stress here is that there is not this monolithic view of the BBC or mainstream media within alternative media outlets. There is this sense that for some, the BBC is an object of criticism, but for some, it's actually a good thing, or at least public service broadcasting is a good thing. So to wrap this up with three kind of forward conclusions to help aid questions and debate. Alternative media are heterogeneous and dynamic in terms of their agendas, norms, and practices, and this is in contrast to a lot of the static definitions which emerged between 2015 and 2018 when commentary was at its peak. Contingent support for the BBC among left-wing outlets, with some direct antagonism with the press, and then the inverse with right-wing outlets, and then we have antagonism between left-wing outlets as well, which is something that's very interesting to find, and a very strong focus on audience building, social media strategies, and the professionalization of content and organizational practices as well. So I'm going to leave this slide here because I think it might help ground people when it comes to questions. And thank you very much for listening to this presentation.
Great, thank you very much, Declan. Also within time. So we have actually got about 11 minutes within the 25 for questions. So please pop your questions into the chat box. And maybe I'll start. Oh, okay, I think Timothy actually may start. Thank you for a great presentation. This is Timothy Neff. Could you reflect a bit on how these new entrants to the media system diverge from or perpetuate long-standing UK media system patterns?
Could you repeat that, sorry?
Yeah, sure. Could you reflect a bit on how these new entrants to the media system diverge from or perpetuate long-standing UK media system patterns? Right,
yes. So the first thing to say there is that a lot of these sites aren't new anymore. Many of them have been around for a very long time. Guido Fawkes, for example, in our sample, been around for 20 years or so. Novara Media has been around for more than a decade. Squawkbox, again, around for more than a decade. So I guess the idea that they're new is the first thing to point out. They're not necessarily that new anymore. In terms of the kind of how they perpetuate or challenge existing kind of like media logics and things going on in the media system, the first thing to say is that they're 100% an extension of the idea of a hybrid media system. I think they're like quintessential hybrid media actors in the way that they work, incorporating lots of elements from digital ways of doing things, the way they source stories and gather and disseminate, but also, as I kind of showed there, this attempt to bring in older media logics of professionalization and editorial strategies and seeking regulation, the way that they even, some of the more nitty-gritty details of the interviews talking about using inverted pyramids in their articles to kind of really present the information in a very traditional way. I think if you're after like where's the media system heading as a trend, I think they kind of just fit within the way that mainstream journalism is going in terms of being increasingly digital, having to tackle questions around subscription and advertising. There's one of the key things I wanted to get across in this talk was the way that they're not entirely different. They're not alien from mainstream media in the way that they actually work and operate, and the problems and trends they have to encounter and deal with too. Hopefully that answers the question. I know it was a bit broad. Follow up.
Thanks, Declan. So something I was going to ask you, which I think you've talked about before, is this very interesting relationship that some of these outlets have in relation to how they position themselves against the mainstream media system. And it's an almost contradictory relationship often, because they're obviously railing against them while at the same time dependent on them for a lot of the content. I think you've talked about this in a previous presentation I saw. And so I guess my question on the back of what Timothy asked is, it seems like the fortunes of this alternative media system or alternative media outlets is very much bound up with the particular kind of landscape, the media and the political landscape, because a lot of them are railing against the BBC as a particular type of institution. And some of the outlets that you're looking at were very much in some way bound up with the Corbyn era in terms of, you know, their success was based on, but also contributory to the Corbyn era. So I guess my question is, to some extent, how do you see the fortunes of the old media system in terms of how much they're bound up with that, you know, the various developments in politics and the media, and also how to what extent are they just a kind of providing a backlash or versus, you know, some sort of generative kind of momentum of their own that they can actually use to build something that it doesn't just rely on these kind of, you know, this outrage against the mainstream in various respects.
So it's a great question. It really goes to the heart of the kind of existence and nature of these outlets. So the reason that I think it's so important for us to kind of got the more recent data from these guys with the interviews and the content analysis is that there has been a move away from this dependency, if you like, because a lot of them have put a lot of effort into constructing their audiences and building a subscriber base. And Avara Media, for example, has a very healthy subscriber base, enabling it to stand on its own. There's been a big investment in a lot of these outlets in original reporting. So Avara Media is heading in that direction. The Canary has recently tried to do a lot more original reporting to kind of move away from what the kind of, I think, expectation or understanding of them has been, which is that they kind of regurgitate a lot of what happens in the mainstream and reframe it in a way. If there's more time, I'll show you the Breitbart quote where they talk about what they do is they take something from the Guardian and just change the adjectives effectively. So this symbiotic relationship is important. The antagonism between mainstream media and alternative media in terms of how they criticize each other, I think, is something that actually benefits both parties, because you'll see it a lot with mainstream journalists using alternative media as a sort of a thing to kind of distance a boundary draw, basically. But when you see how often a lot of the alternative media presenters and contributors go on the mainstream media to fill slots for producers in mainstream media shows, you realize actually that there is this kind of mutually beneficial relationship in many ways. I'm trying to capture everything you asked about. One of the things I think that's come from our recent content analysis findings, having looked at them, is that there's actually been a decline in media critique from these outlets, and that they're moving away from attacking mainstream media as a kind of strategy, because they don't need to necessarily anymore, because of all sorts of things like algorithms and what drives audiences. You can't necessarily do that kind of thing on social media anymore. So that's kind of affected their content strategy vis-a-vis their audiences and social media algorithms. And the Corbyn thing has been, there's a huge amount of soul searching and looking for a way to kind of go past the Corbyn era, because as you rightly point out, there was this kind of attachment to these populist projects of Corbyn, if you look at it that way, from these outlets. What the Canary and Squawkbox have done is reshape themselves as Starmer critical, which is what we said they would do before it happened, and then they did it because that kind of makes sense. And then what the Avara have done is sort of basically try to broaden their range of content beyond just party politics to kind of reach more audiences as well. So there's been a hugely dynamic shift in terms of how they've arranged their content, what kind of audiences they're seeking, and how they're aiming to position themselves against the mainstream. I think, as well as that, there is this desire to be seen as legitimate, you know, through the way that they behave and act, which might explain perhaps I think there are some interview quotes that do talk about this, kind of explains the decline in criticism of the mainstream media, toning it down. I think a lot of people have talked about. So yeah, I mean, there's a whole range of things in that range that we can talk about.
Okay, we have a few minutes left, and we've got a couple of questions in the chat. The first one here from Nick Newman, who says, it's interesting that these partisan alternative political sites seem to have had less of an impact in the UK than other countries, at least in terms of big audiences / recognition, according to our digital news report data anyway. And the impact seems to have become even lower since 2017. Do they see it that way, or do they feel they are playing a big part in influencing debate?
Yeah, we pay close attention to the digital news report stuff on alternative media. Actually, our own survey that we did was very much in tune with what you guys found in terms of audience share and reach. I think there's more ways to look at it. However, I think well, a lot of this stuff can happen below the radar on social media for a start. I mean, that's one way it can happen, but I don't think it happens in a consistent way. I think what you see are spikes, and depending on what kind of period of time you're looking at, you can maybe miss or capture these spikes. It's very much, again, a hybrid media system, I think, where they are trying to intervene on certain issues at certain times. We actually have a name for this. This is a kind of typology that we've been coming up with. So, you know, the term hyperpartisan is backed up in our findings for a lot of these sites, especially during elections. We can think of them as electoral hyperpartisans that will get behind a political candidate strongly and really push that agenda. Issue partisans, I think that's where we look at the right-wing outlets a lot more in terms of getting behind things like Brexit, but not necessarily on a partisan basis, because they're kind of critical of all the parties. And this point here about political cycle specialists is the one I think that kind of is important, because that's where they try to intervene tactfully into the political information cycle, and, you know, use their leverage in very specific blink and you'll miss it kind of ways, if you like. The other thing as well to take into account is the absorption of the journalists that work for alternative and independent media outlets into the mainstream through appearances on broadcast programming, right? So people like Tom Harwood, who's been recruited to GB News and is often on the BBC, Ashley Carr, who's often, you know, invited on the BBC. These are key ways in which they kind of influence the broader political climate. So in a way, their outlets are platforms, if you like, for, you know, traditional agenda setting processes that happen in broadcast media. Is another way of looking at it, I think.
Thanks. And we have just about got enough time just to take the last question that Christian asked. And you've kind of covered some of this since it was asked, but parts of it are worth your thoughts anyway, I think, which is the question is, given that alternative media operate in a hybrid media system, is your project studying the relationships they have with more established news media outlets, for instance, in terms of overlapping career paths or intermedia agenda setting? So I guess you've already just covered that in a certain respect, but particularly in that respect of overlapping career paths. You just mentioned GB News, you know, is there some sort of feed through in that respect, or in any other way that Christian posed that question there?
Yeah, totally. So there's a plan to write a book in the end which will cover all this, but I've been collecting all sorts of secondary data which follows the career trajectories of people like Tom Harwood and others. So there's definitely a thing that we've kind of absorbed into the project and look at. I'm really glad you asked about intermediate agenda setting, because I wrote out a whole plan for a study which we didn't have the time to do in the end, which basically was going to try and measure, in some sense, an intermediate agenda setting by looking at broadcast appearances of certain individuals, and then trying to trace activity afterwards and before on social media and in outputs from you know, tabloids and stuff, to see if basically there was a kind of positive correlation between you know, appearing on broadcast media and then having some sort of agenda setting impact. So I mean, it's something we're really interested in looking at. I think it's really important. I'm not sure if we have the resources alongside all the other things to do it, but hopefully we will. It'd be great. Fantastic.
There is one further comment, but it's in the chat box by Chris Roberts. Perhaps that's something that you could address in the chat box in a moment. There's quite a lot to unpack there. It's talking about left-wing media ecosystem and the factors that might shape such a thing. But I think at the moment we now have to move on to the next presentation. So thank you very much, Declan. We will now move on to a presentation by Anne Schultz. It's a long title, so maybe I'll allow you to introduce it, Anne, on political partisanship and trust and so on, based on a data set from 6 countries. And Anne is representing herself from University of Zurich, but also Richard Fletcher and Rasmus Kleist-Nielsen from University of Oxford. So take it away, Anne.
Thanks so much. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry about the title. Indeed, it's very long, and I took the liberty to shorten it a bit. So it's slightly different from what you see in the program, but still it's really long. Thanks for the introduction. I just moved to Zurich. My co-authors, Richard Fletcher, Rasmus Kleist-Nielsen, are still at the University of Oxford. This project is very much a project from the University of Oxford, or from the Reuters Institute, so more specifically. We are what we are doing here. What we want to explore is the link or the association between trust in the news and trust in the government. So basically, the observation that those who trust the news are also very likely to trust politics and the government, or the other way around. Those who distrust one entity will always be very likely to distrust the other. And this is per previous research. And what we add to this research with our study here is that we basically apply further conditions to it. So we look at news and politics, not as institutions, but as the title gives away, as sources for coronavirus information. And we do this using two survey studies, two cross-sectional survey studies. So taken at two different points in time. I will talk more about that later. And we do this across several countries. And at last, we are also adding to this the question of what role political partisanship may play for this relationship between trust and information, trust in the news and trust in politics. Leaving that aside for the moment, the part on political ideology and starting with the link between trust in the government and trust in news and what previous research has to say about it. It was found to be so strong, actually, that it was given a name, which is the Trust Nexus. And you might have come across that paper that was published in IJPP in 2017 by Thomas Hanich, Nina Steinel, and Anfan. And in their discussion, they summarized their findings as I've quoted on the chart. Their analysis, which was done using the World Value Survey data, for those of you who haven't read it yet, their analysis showed that an exceptionally strong association between political trust and trust in the press, and that leads them to conclude in sort of very dramatic ways, but I really like how they put it, that both media trust and political trust are bound by what they term a common destiny, and they are caught in an inescapable relationship. And I will come back to this quote in the end of my presentation and reflect it against our findings. This relationship then, in addition to being very strong, was also found to grow stronger over time. So where trust, or in countries where trust in one entity decreased, trust in the other entity was also found to decrease, what they termed the race to the bottom, or where trust increased in one, trust also increased in the other, with what they termed basically an upward spiral. And then a last finding that they found, which might also be important context for the interpretation of our findings then, was that this relationship was more pronounced in ideologically polarized societies. And an important question to ask in this context, but we won't be able to tackle it really with our data, but still I think we should devote a couple of thoughts to it, is what explains this trust nexus? So why is it that people who trust the news also trust the government for most parts? Some possible explanations here on that slide taken from that paper and from its discussion, and I added one myself. So it could be, that would be explaining the part where people distrust those entities, or could help us to explain it, that this is part of some people's populist worldview, and also it could also be reinforced by populist politicians, what is backed up by research from the populism realm, which shows that those who hold negative attitudes toward politicians also perceive the news media to report hostile against themselves or trust the news media less. Another option, which will be very difficult to test, I think, but maybe you could consider it, it could also be part, the authors reflect, of a wider mediatization process in which politics is increasingly tailored to fit the logic of the news media. What would then, that's the thought, or the line of thought, would then on the citizen side lead to a perception of these two entities being very close together. Thirdly, it could also be journalism's own sowing of the seeds when they report critically about politics or negatively, what is obviously always part of their job. It could also backfire onto themselves in the shoot the messenger kind of sense. Or lastly, something that could be as well is that there is some sort of latent attitude where people are just generally confident or not confident in any type of established institutions, the system as a whole, or democracy, or what have you. Questions that we actually want to tackle, though, are starting on the slide. So we are thinking that to this nexus, there might also be differences when we speak about media and politics as institutions versus media and politics as sources of information. So that Hanich study that I've just cited, using the World Value Survey data, the items that they had were trust in the press and trust in politics, so treating these two as institutions, but there could be a difference if we treat them as sources of information. There might be differences regarding the topic for which these two are sources of information for, and there might be further differences across contexts. Take routine times as an example versus pandemic times, which is what we will be focusing on. There could also be differences across countries, and then this is what we want to investigate now, basically, with the study. So we want to look at whether the trust nexus applies when we treat news media and the government as sources of information on COVID, in the early weeks of a pandemic, and then again repeated the same study a year into the pandemic a year later, and in different countries. And that's all put in the title of the slide, for which is very long, and in that first research question as well. And then secondly, moving on to the second research question, something else that we want to explore on now is based on the observation that people can have very, very different views about the news media and also about the government, depending on their political orientation, depending on where they stand politically. This is, we don't really have to talk much about how this influences how people perceive the government. So if you are self-placed on the left side of the political spectrum and your government is conservative, you will like it much less than someone who places on the right of that left-right wing dimension. But this also seems to happen when it comes to news media and how people perceive the news media. And I'm illustrating that here using charts from the Digital News Report that we've published in 2020 for the UK and the US. It's pretty clear that trust in most news most of the times depends on where you stand politically. In the UK, it's usually the right over the years that has trusted the news a bit more than the left, and in the US, it's been the other way around, and it's been a very pronounced gap while Trump was the president. So then the second, so if political orientation is able to alter the way that people trust the news, and it's able to alter the way in which people trust the government, it might also be able to alter the way or the way the trust nexus looks like, or the strength of the link between the two. This is our second research question that explores this. That's the data that we used, 2 cross-sectional survey data sets, online survey data, one from March and April 2020, when the pandemic had just hit Europe. It's been in South Korea for a while, and it was moving over to Argentina and the US. And then again in April and May 2021, basically a year later in these same 6 countries. And we've published 2 reports based on these data sets. So if you want to know more about what we did there, please feel free to access these 2 reports on our website. These are the 2 most important measures that we used for this study. So trust in news organizations and trust in the national government was measured using a scale from 0 to 10, not at all trustworthy to is completely trustworthy. And political orientation was used, measuring the classical measure. With this in mind, where would you place yourself on the following scale, which ranged from very left to very right and offered a don't know option. And I've basically shown you here the size of each group. So we have lumped together all those on the left, and we've lumped together all those on the right into 2 groups, which makes for 4 groups in total, which we will contrast against each other, computing interaction effects. These are the first results. We start out pretty simply. I'm going to guide you through one chart in more detail, and then I'll just throw them all at you and hope that it will be easier for you to read them once I've guided you through this one. So we've plotted trust in the government here against trust in the news. And then it's a heat map type of chart. So where darker areas appear, this is where many cases load, basically, so to say. And for the case of Germany in 2020, we have many cases up here in the upper right corner, where many people trusted the government and trust the news as sources for COVID information. You also have that dark spot down here where many people didn't trust either of the 2. And just to illustrate how the chart works, use another dark point where people didn't trust the government, but moderately trusted the news. And that whole pattern makes for a pretty strong correlation between trust in the government and trust in the news, which sits at 0.72 according to the correlation coefficient. And that white line is illustrating the correlation further. How does that look like in other countries in 2020? That's the charts as to that. So just running over from the left to the right, you see that in all countries that we had, the correlation was positive, and it was also significant. I didn't put the asterisks, but it's been significant. It gets a bit lower towards the US, but even here, the more you trust the news, the more you trust the government as well. And I will focus on the US results more in a second, so I won't talk too much about why it's weak. This is adding the 2020 results here in the second row. So the first row shows the charts that you've just seen. The second row is for 2020, and you can compare the results for each country by going through the columns now. As to Germany, Spain, and South Korea, we basically see no changes. If we compare the coefficient, it's changed in its size by only 0.01, which is nothing. In the UK, it got a little bit stronger. In Argentina, it got a little bit weaker. And then in the US, as you can see, this is one of the most interesting findings I think that we come with here, is that where we had the weakest correlation in 2020, we now have the strongest correlation between trust in the government and trust in the news in 2021. Zooming in on that, then, because it's pretty interesting, during the Trump administration and when the pandemic first hit, trust in news and trust in the government correlated rather weakly with each other when compared to other countries. And then a year later, and under a new Biden administration, the correlation between trust in news and trust in the government is as strong as nowhere else in our data. And we will get back to discussing this in the end. But on to the second set of results. Again, I'm leading you through one chart for Germany here. We wanted to know about the role of political orientation. This is the result of a regression model that used trust in news as the dependent variable. And then next to several control variables, we entered an interaction term for trust in the government and political orientation to see if that relationship between trust in the government and trust in news varies depending on where people or in which political group people sit. And as to Germany, you see that all these lines that represent each of these political groups sit pretty much on top of each other, which shows you that there is no such interaction effect, also not in the table that underlies these data or that informs this plot. There's no significant interaction effect here. So for Germany, no matter where you stand politically, if you trust the government, you also trust the news, or the other way around. Other countries and 2020 findings. I will just sort of scan these 6 charts, and the main thing that you should realize is that all these lines, also if they vary slightly and differ in some countries, they are all positive. So the trust nexus is evident in all countries and all political groups. Those who trust the government more also trust the news more, providing strong evidence for that trust nexus. Some things to just flag, or some significant differences that we found, some interaction effects that were different. If you focus on the UK, for example, you see that the red slope that represents the left is slightly shallower than the other groups. And this effect was actually statistically significant, which would mean then that the trust nexus in 2020 in the UK was slightly less expressed among those on the left, and the same is true in South Korea. Then there is the US, about which we have to talk again, which I will do after showing you the 2021 results. Again, if you compare column-wise, you see that there are little changes. I can't go into all of them in detail. I've written them down on the chart. I just want to focus on the US. As you see, and as you might have expected after looking at the bivariate correlation charts, the heat maps, there's the biggest difference if we compare these 2 years. So in the US, focusing on 2020 first, during the Trump administration, the trust nexus was similarly weak, but still expressed among all political groups. And we found strong level differences. So for Democrats, which are the red here, which is not intuitive for those of you who are from the US, but for Democrats, the trust in news was high in relation to rather low trust in the government. For Republicans, the blue group, trust in news was low relative to high trust in the government. And then a year later, and under a Biden administration, these level differences are all gone, and the nexus is much stronger overall, the strongest nexus, as I've said, that we found across all countries. And with center here as the reference category, it's even strongest among those on the right, so among Republicans. So that blue line that you see here is slightly steeper than the other lines. In summary, so this has been very many charts, so I'll summarize that just in Britain here. Using cross-sectional survey data from 6 countries gathered in the early weeks of a global pandemic, and again a year later, we find strong support for the trust nexus when treating the government and news organizations as sources of information about coronavirus. Those who trust the government also trust the news, and the other way around in 2020, in 2021, and in all 6 countries studied. This nexus is barely depending on political orientation. We see that across all political camps, those who trust or don't trust politics also trust or don't trust the news. And then sometimes political orientation makes a small difference for the strength of the nexus. For example, we saw it to be stronger among those on the left in the UK or in Argentina, but still in all political groups. And I know I'm creating redundancies here. If people trust the government, they're also likely to trust the news. What do we make of this? What does this all mean? So going back to that quote from Hanich and al, that I introduced to you on the first slide, are the news media and politics then caught in an inescapable relationship? Well, this data would probably strongly support this notion. The way the public thinks about the news media is very strongly tied to the way it looks at political institutions, also if we assess these as sources for a specific topic. But how problematic is the trust nexus then? Now, we found it to be weakest in the United States, where at the time the president despised the media as the enemy of the people, and thereby he drew a very clear line between the political and the media sphere. So if you were looking for a way to escape the trust nexus, this would be one, but it would be hardly one that I would recommend, right? And then the change to the Biden government has normalized the trust nexus. So against this backdrop, I'm wondering how problematic that trust nexus then really is, and if it could be taken as an indicator for democratic stability. I'm not super sure about that myself yet, but it could be something that worth discussing in this with this audience here. And then another question still related to this for future research. I'm wondering in how far the US example shows us that the nexus is more susceptible to change in politically polarized countries, and that is something that we could clearly look at also using our data here, just that we haven't done this yet. I thank you very much for your attention. I'm probably over time. Sorry about that, if that's the case. And I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you, Anne. Yes, I'll start with an apology. I was trying to get my head around everything you were showing me so much that I forgot to look at my timer. So only a minute or two over. So we've still got several minutes, about 10 minutes for questions. And we'll start with one from Christian, who says, thanks for a great presentation. Considering your earlier work on populism, if you could run the study in 30 different countries, would you hypothesize that the trust nexus works differently when a populist party or leader is in power, as in the US in 2020 versus 2021?
Good question. Well, it could be. That's probably all I can say. I'm trying to think of a country where we would find some or expect similar findings or similar changes. I mean, a populist leader would always would not always, but it is something that's common for populist parties and populist politicians to express the strong rhetoric against the news media. So if they are in power, their followers would probably follow that idea and develop similar attitudes, which would then lead to the trust nexus to break, right? This is maybe something that could happen. I'd still be careful to just generalize from the US onto other countries. But maybe, it could be a way to think about it when we have populist leaders in power, that similar patterns occur. But I guess we would just have to collect data on that.
Great. Christian follows up by saying, I suppose the theory would be that populist voters experience cross pressures when their leaders are in power. They want to trust the system of which the media is part, but they also hear a lot of media bashing from those in government. Mm-hmm. One thing I was going to ask was about, speaking of these factors, to what extent do you detect or theorize any kind of pandemic performance as a factor here in relation to both measures of trust? Because certainly speaking from the experience of the United Kingdom, that there was quite a lot of discussion, particularly in 2020, around trust in the media, losses of trust in the media, at the same time as many people went to the mainstream media like the BBC for information. And it was quite an interesting discussion that people had about an apparent kind of crisis of trust in the mainstream media. So did you detect any kind of pandemic performance of the government or of the news media in terms of their performance in relation to these measures?
Well, I think in the early days of the pandemic, and that's also somehow visible in these heat maps that I've shown, is that we had what others have observed or documented as that rally around the flag effect when it comes to the government. So actually trust in the government was pretty high in the beginning or initially, especially in the UK, or also definitely in the UK. And that coincided with high trust levels in the news as well. And this will have also informed these strong correlations that we've seen in the study. A year later, this correlation is still pretty strong in all these countries, but if you look at the heat maps, I didn't really point to it, but the dark blue area that you saw in the top right moved further down. So trust decreased a little in both entities or regarding both entities. I'm not sure if that's the response to your question. Maybe make that one point again.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. I was just wondering about that kind of, you know, those two moments, and in terms of whether or not, so there's government pandemic performance, and obviously we did definitely experience that rally around the flag effects in this country, as you noted, but also there was kind of particularly from at least this is anecdotal, but particularly from people on the right, as the year progressed, certainly over the summer period, there was a lot of antagonism towards you know, the BBC and other broadcasters. So I guess that would have shifted the shape of the graph somewhat there.
Well, it's not super visible, I would say, if that happened in that data. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. We have a question from Ozan, who says, "Thanks for the great presentation, Anne. Given the strong correlations, I wonder what would be considered as a threshold value for the trust nexus. Would it also be possible to focus on the small segment of the samples who display heterogeneous / inconsistent trust for government versus news? How do they differ from the rest?"
Super good question. Good thought. I haven't thought about it this way. So a threshold value, that's your first point. I guess we should probably always look at this in relation to each other, comparing across countries. That I think would make most sense. Threshold values will always have limits or limitations, I guess. It could be helpful in some scenarios, I could see it, but I probably would try, if I have the resources, I guess, obviously, I would try to do that type of research across countries and then compare the strength of that association across countries. And then the second question on to look at those where the next basically doesn't apply, these groups, that could be super interesting to see where these attitudes come from in that case, whereas like for most parts, these two seem to align. There's also people for those where these don't align, and what causes this. I have no spontaneous idea, but it could be an interesting avenue for future research too.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, actually, do you think there's anything interesting to some of the sort of phenomena that you described about some of these extreme cases where people are very eager to express their antipathy towards the government and the media? You know, the people that are found in the corners where they're really eager to express discontent or you know, or approval of the media or the government. And I guess that would go for any of those four corners of your graph, because they're very interesting examples. So I presume the people in the bottom right of those graphs are perhaps very right wing or something, maybe where they completely distrust the government, but they're really in favor of let's say a right wing government, or you know, there could be other examples from the other corners. Is there anything interesting in respect of, you know, those particular segments of the population in terms of their willingness to express such extreme, let's say, views on these matters?
But no, I haven't really looked into these groups most particularly, because they're also minorities. I think that is a first observation I would make here. Even if they're on the right, we've seen that for those on the right, the trust nexus still applies. So there will only be very little or very few people for whom that is true. But yeah, I mean, you could probably take them out and see what explains this specific attitude to learn more about it, but I haven't done it yet, so I have to disappoint you on that with an answer here.
Thanks, no problem, man. It's a very interesting presentation, lots to think about. I think we have to probably call it there, unfortunately. Subayan has a question in the chat box that maybe you could respond to individually in the chat while Christian finishes up the session for today. So thanks very much, Anne, and also thank you to Declan and Anfan earlier on for your brilliant presentations, and thank you also for the questions that we had during that. So I'll pass over to Christian. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thank you to the panelists and the colleagues who contributed to the discussion. It's been another great day of discussions on research on important topics, and I'm delighted about how it is going. This is time for me just to say goodbye, and I hope to see you tomorrow.